All right, so good morning, or actually good afternoon, everyone. This is what happens when you're working from home. The morning and evening are kind of meshed into one. It is my pleasure to be moderating this session today on Black immigrant experiences. I have had the pleasure of working with all three of today's panelists in different projects, and they'll be presenting on that work. Our first presentation will be by Shelby, who will be presenting on perspectives on the Black Lives Matter movement. So Shelby is a senior, double majoring in sociology and African American and African diaspora studies. And she will be graduating this semester. She plans on pursuing a Master's of Arts or a PhD in either sociology or ADS with a preference for a combined program. Her research interest includes race, ethnicity, socioeconomic stratification in the US, and particularly African American youth and the educational system in the South. As she has worked as an AmeriCorps member and plans on joining Teach for America in the future. So without further ado, I pass it on to Shelby, who will be presenting on Black immigrants' perspectives on the Black Lives Matter movement.
Thank you, Dr. Girma. Okay. So let me share my screen. Something is popping up that's saying advanced sharing options on my side.
Try again. Try to share your screen again.
Okay. Yeah, it's just saying who can share, only host, and then it says all panelists.
Okay, try again. Sorry about that.
Okay. It's popping up again.
You've now been made a host.
Okay.
You should be able to. And it also says all panelists have sharing capabilities on my side. So give me 1 second to see.
Okay.
Sorry, give us 1 moment.
So when we tried it out earlier, it was working fine. So I'm not sure what's happening at the moment. So participants, please bear with us as we sort out some of these technical difficulties. Unfortunate in a Zoom world.
Okay. Are you still getting the same?
No, I can share it now.
Okay.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
You see it? Okay.
You can see it. Yes.
All right. So I will be presenting on the Black immigrant perspective on the Black Lives Matter movement. So just to give you guys a little bit of background, we started research on Black ethnic diversity as a class in spring 2020, and we were researching Black ethnic diversity with Afro-Caribbeans, African Americans, and Continental Africans. And then when COVID hit, we switched gears, and me and Korrey continued this research into the summer, and I took it in the avenue of Black Lives Matter. So the objective of this research is to probe the opinions of African Americans, Afro-Caribbean descendants, and new continental African immigrants on the Black Lives Matter movement. So we conducted 17 interviews together, and our findings suggest that while the majority of our respondents support the movement, there's no consensus of the role for Black immigrants within the movement. So what is the Black Lives Matter movement? So Black Lives Matter is a social movement that was founded by 3 Black women, Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi. It's a social movement that was formed in response to the unjust killings of unarmed Black people. One of the most prominent cases involves Trayvon Martin, and that occurred in 2012. Something important to remember about the movement is that it has no formal hierarchy. There are some prominent activists who associate themselves with the movement, but there is no centralized leadership within the movement. Methodology. So for this study, we collected data using qualitative methods. We conducted 17 in-depth interviews with a semi-structured interview schedule. Some of the questions we asked were in regards to the Black Lives Matter movement, were about participation, how they felt about it, and what they think the role of other Black individuals outside of their ethnic group should be within the movement. And so due to COVID, we conducted all of our interviews through virtual meeting platforms such as Zoom or Google Meet. Then we took the data from our interviews and transcribed them and coded them into a spreadsheet divided by ethnic group and the question that was asked. Data. So this is a chart detailing our number of participants and average age by ethnic group. So for African Americans, we had 6 participants and the average age is 20.2. For Afro-Caribbeans, we had also 6 participants and the average age is 21.4. For continental Africans, we had 5 participants and the average age is 24.75. So we had a total of 17 participants and an average age of 21.92. So with our participants, most of them were undergraduate college students. We did have a few graduate students, but we stuck with young Black folks. So into our results, I'm starting with African Americans. So for support, all African Americans support the movement and there's overwhelming support. For participation, every participant participated in some capacity. Due to COVID, some mentioned that they wanted to do online advocacy. So that was on social media platforms such as Instagram or Twitter, and that was just sharing petitions or donating. And so this is a quote from one of our African American participants. And this participant was basically saying that the movement is spreading awareness to what's going on in the diaspora and basically creating more advocacy for other issues going on. And so they said, our people are bringing in other people from the diaspora into the conversation. I saw a thread of Afro-Latino, Afro-Caribbean people who had died by the hands of police brutality. So for Afro-Caribbeans, majority of Afro-Caribbeans support the movement. We did have one participant who expressed concerns about the intended purpose of the movement and said they don't support the movement. But other than that, we had majority support. For participation, most participants participated in some capacity with protests and advocacy on social media. So at the bottom, we have another quote from a 24-year-old Afro-Caribbean participant, and they stated, I think we should all be protesting. It's not an exclusive issue that just happens to African Americans, but it should be any of us, but it could be any of us, our children, our families. So this participant was talking about the role of Afro-Caribbeans within the Black Lives Matter movement. And they felt like Afro-Caribbeans should assume the same role of African Americans within the movement because police brutality can happen to them as well. Continental Africans. So first report, all continental Africans support the movement. Among continental African participants, most of them mentioned George Floyd and how his death inspired them to get involved within the movement in some capacity. So all participants participated in the movement. Some participated in protests, advocacy on social media, and donations. So this quote at the bottom is from a 25-year-old continental African participant. And they said, I think our role is whatever the African Americans want us to do. It's their movement and I don't feel like we should intrude. And this quote was in regards to the role of continental Africans within their movement, within the Black Lives Matter movement. And that leads me right into my discussion. Why is the Black Lives Matter movement seen as an African American movement? So Black Lives Matter originated in the African American community and is largely supported by the African American community. So that's one reason. It's also been seen as a movement that is a continuation of the civil rights movement. So that's one of the main reasons it's seen as an African American movement. Something that I noticed among continental African and Afro-Caribbean participants is that they believe police brutality is something that predominantly affects or primarily affects the African American community. So they stand in solidarity with the movement, but they see police brutality as an issue that doesn't necessarily affect their community as much as African Americans. So my second discussion question, why is there confusion surrounding the intended purpose of the movement? So one reason is the slogans associated with the movement. I focused in on defund the police, which was used during summer of 2020, and ACAB, which means all cops are bastards. So these two slogans were associated with the movement during summer of 2020, and they've led to some confusion. With defund the police, some think that it means that they're calling for the abolishment of the police force, and some think it means allocating police funds somewhere else in the community, such as education or social work, something of that sort. With ACAB, they're calling for the complete abolishment of the police force. And so with these slogans being associated with the movement, there has been confusion about the intended purpose. Something important to remember is that Black Lives Matter isn't a one issue movement. It started out for police brutality, but it shifted into other sectors. If you look on their website, they talk about mass incarceration, racial inequity in the education system. So it's not a one issue movement anymore. And so just to give a blanket statement, I would say that the movement is focused on racial equality, just not police brutality, but it's just to give an overall, I would say racial equality. Another reason why there's confusion around the intended purpose of the movement is the media, and they're focused on rioting and looting, and that kind of shifts people's opinions about the movement and kind of sways them away. So limitations and future recommendations. So we had a 12:5 ratio for men to women. So that was one of our limitations within our study. Another reason is our study was conducted under COVID, which disproportionately affects Black communities. For future recommendations, we recommend replicating the study at a larger scale. Personally, I feel like it would be interesting to see the thoughts of older African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, and continental Africans. We focused in on college students, but it would be interesting to see older adults because college students are known to be a little bit more progressive. So it would be interesting to see if these thoughts and feelings are the same across age. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelby, for that lovely presentation. So for any participants, for any of the attendees who have questions for Shelby, you can start putting it in the Q&A section, but we'll save all the answers until the end, until everyone has presented. So we'll go straight into the next presentation, which is by Korrey Monroe. He will be presenting on the concept of Black model minority. So Korrey is a junior. He's majoring in public health and minoring in African American and African diaspora studies. He plans to pursue a master's in public health, followed by a PhD in epidemiology, with an eye on a future career with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, so the CDC. So Korrey is currently a McNair Scholar, and the title of his talk for today is there such a thing as a Black model minority? So Korrey, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Girma. Hey everyone, I hope you're enjoying the CACE conference this far. My name is Korrey Monroe, and today I'll be presenting on the topic of, is there such a thing as a Black model minority? So the purpose of our study is to investigate Black American perspectives on the concept of a Black model minority, more specifically focusing on the three ethnic groups within the United States within the Black community, which are African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, and continental Africans on this issue. So what is a model minority? A model minority is a demographic group whose members are perceived to have high educational attainment, high income, high socioeconomic standing, high family stability, and low criminality. This term was This term was created by the white population in order to denigrate African Americans and to place Asian Americans on a higher pedestal. However, the white community does not take into consideration the different challenges and factors that happen to take place in the Black community, prohibiting them from being as successful at or getting to a different level of attainment as whites perceive Asian Americans to be on. So this term of a model minority is a way to, it's another form of racism. And it is trying to pick out certain individuals from an ethnic group or a race to say that they are better than their race as a whole. So some different problems that are associated with this is the number one, which is discrimination and racism. As I stated, you are trying to pick and choose from this population who is a model minority or who isn't, or who is doing the right thing, or you only can have this certain type of success to be considered a model minority. Access to resources. When you think about the Asian American community compared to the Black community, as white people have created this concept to focus on, you don't have the same access to resources. A child in a poverty-stricken neighborhood in the Black community does not have the same education or even nutritional benefits as most Black communities that are poverty-stricken are food deserts. Mental health is another important issue when it comes to reaching a certain level of attainment within the Black community, as in recent years, it hasn't been taken as seriously, but now it's progressively becoming more important in our community, as a child in a poverty-stricken neighborhood who possibly has been exposed to violence could possibly have PTSD or another mental health issue. But those are things that could possibly limit them from reaching that level of attainment. Financial status and class. A parent who does not have a certain amount of money cannot provide for their child as much as another group. So as we know, Black Americans are mistreated every day, including in the workforce, which focuses back on how much money they make or how they're able to provide for their family. Opportunities presented. Without affirmative action back in the 1960s, 1970s, even before then, you see the different opportunities represented to the Black community were not the same as the Asian Americans, as Asian Americans and white people were getting better treated than Black people. Your environment. You are not able to thrive in an environment that does not support you, that does not help you get to where you want to be in life. And in comparison to the Asian American community, Black Americans have a more harder time struggling as they not have access to resources such as, like I said, education or even a job. Sustainability, being able to consistently provide for your family or even to just provide a meal. Politics, there's not enough representation in Congress and the Senate for Black people for these issues to be spoken about, or even at your local level of your government. And systematic oppression is something that we're all aware of when it comes to the Black community. So some scope and limitations of our study. So the first scope and our limitation was the ability to do research and collect data within a virtual setting. As we know, COVID-19, the pandemic, it hinders what you can do in person. So most of our data collection and our interviews were held on Zoom or Google Meet, having a small sample size. So as I stated before, it was hard to get interviewees for our research project, which limits us to generalize these findings to a larger society or a larger population. But we were able to get some concept and ideas of the individuals that we interviewed to get an understanding of what people are thinking about the term of a model minority. And observation and recall bias. We understand that people are not able to accurately replicate their stories of their stories that they've had with discrimination or racism, as well as being able to accurately give us information, as sometimes people just tell you what you want to hear. So those were some limitations that we had within our study. So our data consisted of pseudonyms, genders, ages, and the different ethnicities within the Black community. So as you see on the screen, we had 10 participants from the African American community, 8 participants from the Afro-Caribbean community, 8 participants from the continental African community, and 2 participants that were bi-ethnic, which were African American and continental African, and African American and Afro-Caribbean. Our age ranges range from 18 to 29 years old, and we do understand that it's kind of centered around college students and younger adults, but we wanted this because of the different perspectives within each age. As a child or a student in college does not have the same perspective as a person in graduate school or somebody that's in the workforce now and experiences these different types of racism. There's different levels of racism within society. So being able to have these different perspectives and to understand all that people go through on a multiple level basis makes our data more accurate and more accurate to convey these ideas to a more larger society. Our results. So African Americans. All of the African American participants rejected the concept of a Black model minority and found it dehumanizing. Due to stereotypes and prejudice, individuals of a group may seem more likely to not be a model minority. One of our participants stated, "I definitely feel like African Americans as a whole are looked down upon more because I just feel that we have this stigma, negative stereotypes of being violent." So that in itself, because of who you are and who we are seen as in America alone, that just puts you at a lower rank when it comes to model minority or being seen as a good person in society because it's the color of your skin. Another participant stated, "I would call it tokenism because the model minority myth was set up by white people to shame African Americans like it was set up by white people to place on other races." So not only is the term of a model minority dehumanizing, it's also a way to be seen as a golden person or, to be accepted by the white society. But the thing is, while you're coming up and you're being seen as so good in another person's eyes, you're really shaming and trashing the people like you, who you really should be looking to help and support and to really help obtain the success that you want to attain. And lastly, there are multiple paths that can create success, not just the one model. So when our participant said, "I don't think there's any model Black person or any model minority." That minorities come from different backgrounds and upbringing. So just because you went to jail or you have a bad past does not mean that you cannot be successful, does not mean that you can't do what you want to do. Nowadays, you see people being models in our society or being role models simply by starting clothing lines and giving back to their communities and actually doing things for the communities as the community has helped them come up, or they see the problems within their communities which they can help fix. Afro-Caribbeans. All were not aware of what a model minority was prior to the interview, which was a common theme across the board in all 3 groups. There was a general consensus over African immigrants as being the true Black model minority, if it was one possible. And as stated on the screen, Mia, who was 26, stated, "I feel like they were perceived as valuing education more or valuing family more or being more their parents, caring more or being more involved." When I really think that there's other things going on with that. And I think that's kind of just speaks to the immigrant mentality. So as she stated, the views and the morals behind an Afro-Caribbean or a Black immigrant, focusing on your family or being close to your family and possibly, knowing what you have to do to keep providing for your family, that refers back to the immigrant mentality, which kind of aligns with the values of a model minority. However, these are views and values that they have to have because not only are you trying to make a name for yourself and your family in the United States, you're also trying to show the people back home that it is possible to do more. That really centers around the concept of an immigrant mentality. And lastly, emphasizes competition over cooperation, which is a flaw within the Black race as a whole. So it states, with Caribbean people, there's a crab in a bucket mentality. I've noticed, actually, I think that might be in all of the groups. We do not want to see each other doing well. From my experience, I personally know that we all have a difficult time bringing each other up. Some people deal with jealousy, some people deal with greed. But at the end of the day, we should be helping each other get to the top instead of pulling each other down. which is a problem that is really seen within all three groups. Continental Africans. Only one person out of the 8 did not believe in the Black model minority. The reason why she did not believe in that Black model minority is simply because she did not even consider a minority due to her where she was or the geography around the area. And the quote basically states that just because that she's a Black person in a white area doesn't mean that she's any more or less than a white person. As if she went to a Black area, she would not be a minority. So she just didn't want to feel lesser than in society. For the other 7, they concur with the Black immigrants are model minorities. The quote states, I think that would be between the Africans and the Caribbeans. I think as we get older, we're seen as more successful than our Black counterparts. Another person stated, it's the Africans. If I had to specify, I would say it's the Nigerians. I always tend to see Nigerians in higher positions from my perspective. And as we were interviewing the Continental African group, it was this common theme of Nigeria being referenced a lot, as Nigeria is seen as a successful country back in Africa, or not a country, I'm sorry, maybe a country, I'm sorry. But Nigeria is seen as the model for other Africans, as Nigerians have this mentality to keep hustling, keep grinding, to keep getting to where you want to be successful, and also to have money. Discussion. So the majority of our participants rejected the concept of a model minority and did not find it useful, as they found it like dehumanizing to the Black race as a whole, as we were not able to be as better and be as great as white Americans. And Black immigrants, Afro-Caribbeans, and Continental Africans believe that they are the model minority due to their hard work and dedication, taking advantage of the opportunity, living the American dream as Black immigrants and the immigrant mentality. That whole category of hardworking, living the American dream and this immigrant mentality helps to have that drive to do better, to be better for the people in your country, for the people in the United States as a whole. And perspectives and respect for each group varies. That was a common theme, as there was a disrespect amongst the three groups for each other, as Continental Africans and Afro-Caribbeans thought that they were better than African Americans due to them not taking advantage of the opportunities that are here in the United States. But that also comes from a lack of awareness of the problems that African Americans face. Thank you.
Thank you, Korrey, for that presentation. So if anybody has any questions for Korrey, you can start inputting them into the Q&A function, and then we'll get to it after the last presentation. So for Helen, who is the last presenter for today, she will be talking about Ethiopian and Eritrean refugees' mental health. The title of her talk is entitled "We Are Not Okay, a discussion on Ethiopian and Eritrean refugee mental health." Helen is a graduate student in social work. She is on her way to earning her master's in social work, and she plans to pursue her PhD either in the same field, but she plans to continue working with Ethiopian and Eritrean refugees. So Helen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Girma. Sorry.
Are you able to share your screen?
Yes, I just, can you see it?
It's in the middle though. Might want to start at the beginning. Okay.
Sorry. So thank you so much, Dr. Girma. I will present a research project that Dr. Girma and I did in collaboration. It is on Ethiopian and Eritrean refugees' mental health. We have a title, "We Are Not Okay, a discussion on Ethiopian and Eritrean refugees' mental health." So I want to give you a little bit background on the geographical context and the where the refugee camps are located. So our participants are originally from Ethiopia and Eritrea, and Ethiopia is found in the northeastern part of Africa, also known as the Horn of Africa, and Eritrea is found to the north of Ethiopia. So our participant, they came from 4 countries, different refugee camps in 4 countries, refugee camps in Ethiopia, refugee camps in Kenya, refugee camps in Sudan, and refugee camp in Egypt. So the refugee camps in Ethiopia are located in the northern part of Ethiopia called Tigray. So we had participants from Shimalba refugee camp, Adaharish, and Hitsat, and we have a participant from refugee camps in Kenya, which is called Kakuma, and we have refugee camps, participant from refugee camp in Sudan, which is called Kasala. I'm sorry if I said the pronunciation wrongly. So those are a little bit about the geographical context. So our participant from Eritrea, they crossed the border from Eritrea to Ethiopia to get resettlement and seek asylum in Ethiopia, and they'll also go to Sudan, Egypt, and some of them try to pass through Libya to get to Europe through the Mediterranean Sea, which was really the deadliest route to take. But we had participants from both countries who tried to pass through Libya. So that's a little bit about the refugee camp and how the geographical location. Okay. So the research question we tried to ask, we had 3 research questions. The first is, what are the conditions experienced by Ethiopian and Eritrean refugees in pre-migration, in transit, and when resettlement? So we try to explore refugees' life histories in 3 main time periods, in pre-migration, in transit, and resettlement. So in pre-migration, we try to see what are the experiences they faced that contribute to their mental health and that affect their mental health. So kind of like the forced migration, what are the things that make them leave their homelands. And we try to see their journey. And then the journey, I have a figure in the left that shows a little bit about the resettlement process. So when refugees get to refugee camps, they will get registered and they will pass through a couple of interviews to decide if they will get resettled or not. So not every refugee who get to the refugee camp has the chance to be resettled, either in US or different developing countries. So once they get to the once they pass the 2 interviews and they get accepted in the refugees resettlement, they will pass through medical examination, cultural orientation, and then there will be a flight and they will arrive in the US. But I mean, as you can see, the UNHCR data shows 1 in 500 people get resettled every year. And that really is really shocking to see when there are a million of refugees out there in the refugee camp waiting for resettlement. Only 1 in 500 get resettled. That tells you the trauma and the hardship that is happening in the refugee camps. So the research question, as I said it before, we had 3 research questions. One is, what are the conditions experienced by Ethiopian and Eritrean refugees on pre-migration, when they are in the journey, and then when they get resettled? And then we try to see how forced migration affects their long-term psychological well-being. And then what does it matter? So it's kind of like a new area that we were trying to explore. And because of the resiliency that is given to immigrant and refugees, it is kind of like untouched area. And we, as a researcher, we think this is not fair to leave refugees alone and not provide services and not understand what they've been through. So we asked the question, why did this matter, to be able to answer those questions. So the methodology that we use semi-structured in-depth interviews. Because of COVID-19 pandemic, we're not able to do face-to-face interviews. So we were limited to use the technology, the Zoom and Google Meet, which wasn't efficient due to the language barrier, the internet, and many factors. And that really leads us to have a limited number of participants. which is the sample size we had is 17 participants. We have 11 refugee participants and 6 service providers. So we have service providers from African Service Coalition, we have Church World Services, and CNAC, Center for New Carolinas, and different ones in different states. So we, in total, we have 6 service providers. We have 6 service providers. And the researcher personality, Dr. Girma and myself, we are both from Ethiopia, and I am half Ethiopian and half Eritrean, which was really helpful for us to have the insider perspective, being Ethiopian. And we also are, neither of us are refugees, so that gives us the outsider perspective, which both has their own pros and cons. But according to the language, we were able to access the language, and that really that was really positive for the research study. So the data collection, so we have 11 participants, and the average age was 35.9. We have the range because to see the outlier, because we have a participant who was 19 and we have participants who were 51. So there is a range in the age, and the average number of years in transit is 7.2 years. This also is kind of like you will be able to see the outlier in here. We have participants who stayed only 2 years in the refugee camps, and we have participants who stayed 15 years in the refugee camp. And the level of education, we have a wide range of education level within our participant. We have 7 participants who are high school and below, and we have 3 participants with some college courses, and we have 1 participant with a master's degree, which is quite interesting to see. We have a lot of participants who do not pursue their education, but still seek to pursue their education to have a better life. And as you can see, we have 6 female and 5 male participants. We have 3 Eritrean female and 3 Eritrean male participants, and we have 3 Ethiopian female participants and 2 Ethiopian male participants in our research study. So our find is we try to see into different time periods. So the first one is the pre-migration. We try to see what trauma exposed our participants. So we try to see the forced migration. So like when we try to code our data, there were things that came like so many times, and that was like most Eritrean lived their homeland because of the forced migration. There were a lot of political persecution. There were indefinite national service that really is for the Eritrean participants. So the Eritrean government, when they finish high school, when they finish high school, they have to go to a national service, and they have to serve in the national service, which is indefinite time. They don't know how long they're going to stay there. So that really creates trauma. And there is still a lack of religious freedom that still was the Eritrean participant that was mentioned. And there was internal conflict within groups and economic tension for the Ethiopian participant. There were participants who told us they left their homeland because of the internal conflict that was happening in their homeland, and they were forced to leave their homeland, and they don't have anywhere to stay, and they fear for their life, so they fled from their homeland. And there is economic tension. Families were not able to provide for their kids, so they decided to leave to have a better life. And in transit, we try to see the abuse that was happening for both men and women, and in their journey. There was imprisonment that really happens a lot in Libya. So for our participants who try to cross the Mediterranean Sea, they were imprisoned in Libya, and that was and they were tortured, and that was really creates a lot of trauma in their life. And there were economic dependency that people in the refugee camps, they depend on their families sending money, and they live out of the money that is sent from US or Canada. People who left their homeland before them, they could be families, they could be friends, or they could be people from the refugee camp. They get resettlement before them, and that also creates a tension depending on many coming from other places. And there were rape and sexual proposition from smugglers. That really happens for women. Women were prone to rape and sexual proposition when they try to when resettlement time period is longer. Refugee decide to take the route through smugglers, or when they left their country, they try to take the route with the smugglers, and the smugglers will require to have sexual proposition or give a sexual proposition to the participant, and that also creates trauma in our participant. And there was uncertainty mainly because of the waiting time in the refugee camps. So because of the indefinite waiting time in the refugee camps, some people will be waiting for 2 years, and some people may be waiting for 20 years, and still they're not sure that they'll get resettled or not. After 20 years or 12 years, they may still be denied. So that creates a lot of tension and trauma on the refugee participants. And there we find a difference in being urban refugee and camp refugee. We have participants from both. So the urban refugee with a little bit privileged to be a urban refugee because of the housing. They were able to do some work and earn money. But the camp refugee, that was not allowed, and they were living with the donation they get, and then there was not adequate housing and safe housing in the refugee camp, and housing was a main issue. We'll get to that, but housing is the main issue for people in the refugee camp. But to be an urban refugee, you need to have families who are able to send you money to be able to rent a house and provide you money for food and other things. So there is we were able to find a difference being an urban and camp refugee. So when we see resettlement, so once refugees get to the U.S., there are 9 refugee resettlement agencies. So depending on how many they will accept and who they will accept, they will get resettled in one of the states. So they don't choose where they will be resettled. They don't choose where they want to live. So when they get here, they will have a housing, and they will have food for some month and Medicaid for some month, but they're not able to choose. So we try to see the resettlement and the psychological part, the social part, the economic part, and the housing part. So that when we see the psychological part, we see a lot of loneliness and depression, which happened because one participant came by themselves. Maybe they left their family back in the refugee camp, or maybe they left their friend back in the refugee camp. So they will find it hard here to live by themselves. That really creates loneliness and depression. There is also social, which is a cultural shock and language barrier. Participants were not able to find things they are used to. They were not able to speak the language. They were not able to find food that they wanted to eat, their cultural food. And there were a lot of culture shock, including the clothing. The whole thing was a culture shock for them. And language is a real issue in here. To access all the resources, they were not able to access resources because of the language barrier. And there is economic tension, there's economic hardship and economic uncertainty that happens because refugee, most of them, as we see, their educational attainment is high school and below, most of them, like the majority 7 participant we have. So they were not able to find a job that pays a lot, or that are permanent jobs. So they are mostly forced to work temporary job and kind of like 16 hours a day, and they're still not sure if they have that job all the time. So maybe husband only is working, wife is in the house, or wife is working and husband is in the house. So that may not be enough to provide for the whole family. So there's still economic hardship, and the economic uncertainty happens when both parents or both husband and wife doesn't have a job in the house, and there's no way to provide for their kids. And housing is a real issue. So there is the housing they live, they are scared for their kids. The neighborhood, they think that it's not secure, the neighborhoods, and there is lack of resources. The housing that they were explaining, not like air conditioner not working, there is violence outbreak in the neighborhood, and they're not accessible to public transportation. So all those things are issues for housing. And we have gender challenge both for men and women. So women are really prone for domestic abuse. So once they get to the US, maybe in back home, women stays in the house and husband works. But when they get here, maybe husband will be in the house and a wife will be working, and that really creates a tension between the husband and wife, and that really creates a domestic. A husband will start abusing his wife, and that really is an issue within the refugee community. And there is alcoholism and substance abuse as a coping mechanism for main participants. When they get here, I said it earlier, the cultural orientation, they have the ideal America in their mind, and they get here and they don't really get it as they see it. So they use coping mechanism that is mostly alcoholism and substance abuse. So the study limitation, as I said it before, we have really small sample size, which brings the question of generalizability. We may not be able to generalize it to their larger population. Sorry, we may not be able to generalize to a larger population. That happened because of COVID, and refugee reluctant to discuss mental health issues. Refugees were not willing to discuss their mental health issue with us. Mostly they were, because of the stigma, they were able to share with us the experience they saw, the things that they saw in the refugee camps, but they were not really open to discuss their own mental health challenges. We have refugee, we think as a researcher, we think refugee experience trauma in all stages of their forced migration, and we have recommendation for that for a policy change, and we divide that into three main periods. What that is, try to prevent situation that can lead to migration. That may be ideal, but that we still think that is possible, and also providing care and socioeconomic assistance for refugees when they are in transit and refugee camps, and providing culturally appropriate services when refugee resettled in the US. Thank you. Thank you so much for your attention, and thank you so much, Dr. Girma, for giving me the chance to work with you.
Thank you, Helen, for that lovely presentation. I'm sure we all learned so much from all three presentations. So we have a little bit of time for Q&A for anybody who wants to address, my apologies, for anybody who wants to address the panelists. If you have any questions or comments, keep in mind that these are projects that are still ongoing, so they can be amended, and the panelists are looking for feedback from the participants in order to be able to kind of, really hone in on their arguments. So earlier there was a comment by Pat Levitin, sorry if I mispronounced that name, which says Alicia Garza the Alicia Garza book, The Power of Purpose is Beyond Awesome. It's a great handbook for organizing. So thank you for that recommendation. This is in reference to Shelby's presentation. So Shelby and Korrey, you can turn on your cameras. And again, we're open for Q&As. If anybody has a question, please put it in the chat box so that we can address any questions that you may have. The one thing that I forgot to mention earlier as I was introducing the panelists is that both Shelby and Korrey have received funding from UNCG's Undergraduate Research and Creativity Award in order to conduct their research. And both of them have had the pleasure of presenting their work already at the National Association of African American Studies. This was actually a couple of weeks ago, and both of them will also be presenting their work at the Undergraduate Expo at UNCG coming up in April. So this gives them exposure in different areas. So again, if there's any questions, please put them in the chat box. And we are looking for, okay, so there is a question from Ciara Marble. Again, my apologies if I mispronounce any of the names. So this question, I believe, is for Helen. When receiving mental health services, are refugees wanting to meet with a counselor or someone that is from their own culture? And is there challenges with finding someone that is a counselor from that culture and or familiar with cultural norms and information? So Helen?
Yeah, so we were not, so we recommend that they need to be able to get culturally appropriate services, and we think that will work for the refugees. We haven't really tried that. We haven't tried to connect refugees with counselors or therapists that are from Ethiopia or Eritrea. But definitely, if they have the access to do that, definitely that will work. And we don't, I mean, in Greensboro, I don't think there are Ethiopian or Eritrean counselors. I mean, there are people who work in the agency who are Ethiopian and Eritrean, which is great, but they're not like counselors that we can connect our participants to the counselors. So not in Greensboro, definitely maybe in other different states, but we are trying to advocate to have more counselors and therapists and culturally appropriate services, even in the like hospitals. When they go to hospitals, to have like interpreters down, like there are interpreters, but more people who knows the culture and who really understand the background of our participant. So I don't know if I answer your question, but Dr. Girma can say a little bit on that too, because it's our work. If you want to say something on that, please.
So the person who asked the question said, thank you so much, that makes sense. And keeping in mind that this is an ongoing project, and like that question anticipates part 2 of our project in a way, right? Okay, so we have another question from Brandy Saunders. Again, this is for Helen. Says, thank you for articulating the refugee experience. It is a blessing that you and Dr. Girma were able to assist with the critical component, the Ethiopian language. So actually 2 languages, Tigrinya and Amharic. Communication with ensure refugees could get the resources needed. 1 in 500 accepted into the resettlement is alarming. I agree with you there. The experiences refugees go through is eye-opening. I appreciate the understanding. Awesome presentation. So this was a comment for Helen. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I have one quick question for we're almost out of time, but I want to ask one quick question to Shelby and Korrey. And considering that you're both undergraduates, this is the first major project that you've kind of immersed yourself in. What were the things that surprised you? What did you learn? What were the things that were challenging for you in terms of the data collection? And I give you each 1 minute to answer. Korrey, start.
The most interesting thing that I found out was the different perspectives that consist of across the 3 groups. The different respect and disrespect that is shown throughout the groups, and the ability to actually sometimes come together, but sometimes bring each other down. That was a very interesting aspect to see through our research. And the most difficult thing would have to be gathering information through Zoom, data collection through Zoom, especially during the pandemic, because it affects a lot of people, and the COVID-19 pandemic is still affecting the Black community more than anything else. So it's very shocking.
Thank you. Shelby.
So one thing that surprised me was how comfortable people were talking to me about such a sensitive issue such as Black Lives Matter and their experiences of discrimination and prejudice, and how open they were with me, and they didn't know me. So that was interesting for me. Something that was challenging was the transcription process. We did have some longer interviews that were like an hour long, and so it did take me a little bit of time, but we got it done.
Thank you for that answer. So we have a couple more comments in the chat. So the one I'm gonna kind of be selective in here. It says, kudos to the students for excellent work, excellent projects, great job, scholars. And people were saying that was so interesting. I learned so much. So I appreciate that. There was a comment from Brandy as well for Korrey that talked about the Black model minority explanation. And she's asking, you know, like, thank you for highlighting the institutional racism that exists today. It is remarkably interesting that Black model minority would be viewed as dehumanizing. Unfortunately, we won't have time to be able to expound on that a little bit more. So I wish we had more time. Unfortunately, we're kind of short on time, but I want to thank all the presenters, all the panelists for their great projects and for their great presentations. And thank you for all the attendees to be able to join us for today. If you have any questions about any of the projects, you can email me directly, or any of the panelists, I can connect them with you if you have any feedback at any point. So please let me know. I'm working still with all three amazing students. So I'll officially end the session here. Thank you all. Appreciate your time.